Hey guys, like my backdrop? It's pretty, isn't it? As most of you know, I have written a couple of books and had them published. I'm working on the third one and I am pretty close to finishing it up. So what I have decided to do this week in the video is to share the prologue to my third book with you. Now, I stumble over a few words. Yes, I know. I'm not going to re-record the whole thing. Also, I have decided to do 3 books in this series. This is the third one. And if you've read the other 2, this one will bring all of the stories full circle. So I hope you enjoy the prologue. Another thing too, the video that you see in the background has really nothing to do with the story. It's just that I did not want to have my face on screen reading to you for 15 minutes. So that's why you see the background that you do.
Prologue. To dust you shall return. Kansas, 1935. On a stone step at the edge of the porch of a 2-room farmhouse, an overall-clad boy of 11 stood gazing toward the horizon. Most wouldn't call the minuscule area a porch, but it jutted out from the house and gave them a covered area to wipe their boots before stepping inside, as if that mattered. In the midst of the flat land of Kansas that now spread out before the boy, a brown, barren wasteland, dirt made its way into the houses no matter what they tried to do to prevent it. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back to enjoy a clear spring day, a rarity of late, and allowed the sun to bathe his face in its rays. In the air hung a stillness, an eerie quietness they had not experienced for some time. A quick burst of wind picked up, the windmill overhead spinning furiously. Startled at the sudden rhythmic squeak, the boy snapped his head upright, his eyes perusing the yard, looking for something. What exactly he didn't know. He was always on the lookout for some signs of life, but usually the only thing he could make out were the dust-covered plants that had tried their best to poke their heads through the deep taupe dirt, only to be covered again before they could take their first breath. It was a Sunday, and even on a Sunday chores could not wait on a farm. His father was out and about doing his best to keep things running, even though dust storms had become a regular unwanted visitor on their farm. On most days, the boy would be helping with the chores, but his father would always give him a little reprieve on Sundays and let him go to church with his best friend George. The boy enjoyed church. The stories of hope and renewal fed his heart and soul with an uplifting spirit. He would sit and listen to the preacher who would pray for an end to the sorrow and desperation brought on from the uprising of these storms. His father refused to go to church, no matter how many times the boy asked. He blamed God for taking his wife and daughter away from him, and for not putting a stop to these blasted dust storms that were causing the devastation to so many people around him. The boy tried to explain to him what he was learning in church, but his father would just shrug and brush him off. "Aw, boy, God don't love us. There ain't no need to go and beg him for something you know we ain't gonna give." "But, Daddy, it's not God's fault. You know these storms are brought on by people, not God. That's what my teacher says." "Don't matter, boy. You ain't talking me into church. God's not done nothing for me." But still he loved his son and allowed him the couple of hours on Sunday mornings to escape the reality of the lonely, gritty farmland. The boy took in a few deep breaths. It was not very often in recent months the air was clear enough to breathe without at least a hint of dust blocking his nasal passages. A cloudless, cerulean sky hung over the desolate field in front of him, a striking contrast to the parched and brown hue, and at the moment all seemed at peace. This morning at church, the preacher had read from Romans. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? This comforted him. Small for his age, the boy looked to be about 9 instead of the almost 12 years he had lived on this earth. The harsh sun had weathered his face, leaving behind a tan that would partially be washed away when the reddish-brown dirt was scrubbed from it, and Sunday mornings were the few times his face was the color it should be. His light brown hair stuck out on all sides of the hat he wore, and although sad much of the time, his brown eyes would sparkle with the hope of the future every time he laughed. He was wiry and quick, but not too thin. His father did the best he could to provide milk and food for his son, and would sell his soul to keep him fed, and so far, the land had eked out enough food to sustain the both of them, but it was a crapshoot from day to day. The boy sat on the slab of rock and looked over toward the barn. Actually, the barn was quite nice, nicer than the house, in fact. It served many purposes and held a farmer's most prized possessions. His father emerged, a bucket in his hand. Upon noticing his son, he threw up a hand in a wave, a rope dangling from his raised hand. "Hey, son." "Hi, Daddy, can I help?" The boy smiled, shielding his eyes from the afternoon sun. "Nah, enjoy your day off." His father laughed, a raspy sound escaping from deep in his throat, setting off a fit of dry, brittle coughs. His father didn't smoke, but the dust was much worse on one's lungs, creating more respiratory problems in his father than smoking ever would have. The boy watched his father walking along, looking at the pitiful crops, reaching down every so often to shake the dust from the leaves. No rain again. He would have to walk along bringing water to each plant, pouring it from his bucket. This was usually the boy's job. He was young and didn't have to bend as far as his father, whose back had begun to ache and twitch from all of the work. He would groan each time he stood upright. Frustrated, the man yanked a stem from the ground and flung it off to the side and cursed under his breath. Damn rabbits. Along with the seemingly never-ending dust storms, hordes of rabbits had also decimated his father's crop. The boy's tender heart still broke, and he would tear up at the thought of having to slam the stick across the heads of those poor rabbits during the last jackrabbit drive. After all, it wasn't their fault. Their food supply had withered away, and they were only trying to survive. He cringed, thinking about how the myriad of rabbits resembled the ever-present swarms of grasshoppers that would fly into his face, their sticky legs tangling in his hair or clinging to his clothes. The fluff on the back of his neck stood on end at the thought. Looking toward the horizon, he could see a distant storm beginning to develop far across the flatland. It looked like a rain cloud, dark and ominous, bringing cleansing rain and hope. He prayed for it to be so. It rolled in quickly, and it didn't take long for him to realize it was not a cleansing storm, but instead it raged hot, engulfing everything in its path. This one, moving at lightning speed, was coming in with a fury and brought with it devastation and heartbreak. It was the third dust storm in the last month. Each time the scraggly crops would barely begin to perk their heads through the ground from the last drenching of dirt, when another boiling sea of sediment would emerge across the horizon, its ugly, grainy essence choking the life out of everything in its path. "Daddy, here comes another one," the boy called. He stood cupping his hands over his mouth to amplify the sound. His father had returned to the barn after his back-breaking attempt to water the plants, and emerged upon hearing his son's voice drift across the yard. He squinted toward the house, then turned to find the wave almost on top of them. "Get in the house. I'm going to get the cow out of the field and try to put her in the barn. Put this on." The boy's father ran to the house and dipped a cloth in the trough before tossing it to the boy, and did the same thing for himself, wringing it out and tying it around his own nose and mouth. The boy understood his father's need to save the cow. After so many dust storms, they were down to only one to provide their milk, the others succumbing to the smothering dust storms. The boy spent most of his mornings before school milking her and trying everything possible to preserve the white liquid. Many buckets had to be tossed after turning to a reddish, muddy mess. "Daddy, I can help," the 11-year-old offered. "No, go in the house and stay there. Do not come back in the yard. I'll be back in a little bit." His father turned and ran. "No, Daddy," the boy screamed through the flurry of sand now laying on top of them. He could do nothing but stand on the little porch, watching his father disappear into the angry descending blanket of dust. At that point, all other sounds were swallowed up into the loud swirling of the wind-swept grains of sand pinging against the sides of the house and roof. It stung his bare arms and the back of his neck. Breathing proved difficult, even through the wet cloth around his face. He flung his arms up, trying to shield his eyes from the dirt. From somewhere in the distance, he heard the muffled moan of the cow, and her clanging bell sounded a menacing tone. Moments later, through the opaqueness of the descending storm, he heard a far, desperate yell, a cry for help. He stopped, perking his ears for another sound. Anything. Nothing. And he left the porch, something his father told him not to do. "Daddy, where are you?" Struggling against the strong wind and stinging sand pounding his face, the boy fought his way to the field. Except for the loud rush of swirling wind in his ears, it was eerily quiet. No bell, no lowing, no voices. "Daddy?" Up ahead, a mound of dirt was forming, and upon reaching it, the boy realized what he was witnessing. There in front of him, his father lay on the ground in the midst of drowning. Not in water, but under a mound of dust and dirt piling over him, creating a makeshift grave. The massive wave of dirt had proved too much for his father despite his efforts. The cloth had been torn from his face by the wind and dust, and his lungs were filling up fast. As his father had approached the frightened cow, she had turned quickly, her head catching him across the shoulders, knocking him to the ground, and the dirt did not relent. Scrambling to his father's side, the boy pulled the cloth back up over his father's nose and mouth, but discovered he was too late. He ascertained his father was already dead. Tears streaked red rivulets down the boy's cheeks, soaking into the wet cloth covering his own nose and mouth. He buried his face into his father's cheek, closed his eyes, and let the storm ride through. After the piles of sand had blown in and the winds had subsided, the boy rose to find a mound of sand covering 3 things, only one of them still living. Both his father and the cow had succumbed to the overpowering storm, their lungs filling with dirt, suffocating them almost immediately. Standing in the middle of the field, he turned toward every direction, finding what resembled the Sahara Desert, dirt and sand everywhere. There were pictures of the Sahara in his history book at school, miles and miles of rippled sand, mounding up to form dunes throughout the desert. He remembered staring, mesmerized at the photo, thinking he might like to visit one day. But as he looked at what lay all around him, he knew he would never want to go there. He was now totally alone in the world as an 11-year-old child, and he had no idea what to do. His 16-year-old sister had run away to marry her sweetheart. They, like so many others, went west, hopefully making it to California to find better things. He could think of no solution, but he knew he had to leave this place. He had no idea where to go, but he knew it was best to go away. He had nothing left. His mother died of consumption when he was 8, and now his father died in this terrifying way. Why did his father not swallow his pride and take the 3 of them to California after his mother died? The boy was becoming angrier and angrier every second. He ripped the cloth from his face, threw it down, and looked to the west. He considered going to California to find his sister, but had no clue where to start. Instead, he turned east, the sun at his back, and ran.
I know I don't read professionally, but I hope you enjoyed it and look forward to it. Bye.